At 50 years old, I was scrubbing a stranger's marble floor when he walked in, froze, and whispered 3 words that would shatter everything I thought I knew about my life. "You're Edith Mason's granddaughter." I didn't know my grandmother had been anyone worth remembering, but apparently, she'd been someone worth $823 million. If you're watching this video, give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Now let's get to the story. The ammonia from the cleaning solution was burning my eyes that afternoon, my rubber gloves still dripping with dirty water as I worked the grout lines with a stiff brush. My knees ached against the cold marble, and all I wanted was to finish this mansion and pick up my daughter from her shift at the diner before the evening rush started. But this elderly man was staring at my face like I'd risen from the dead. His cane clattered to the floor. His weathered hands reached toward me, trembling so violently I thought he might collapse. "Sir, are you okay?" I scrambled to my feet, instinctively reaching out to steady him. "Should I call someone?" "Edith Mason," he breathed, his voice cracking with emotion. "You have her eyes. That determined chin. Dear God, you look exactly like her." Tears began streaming down his weathered cheeks. I'd been carrying this weight for 40 years, and I never thought I'd see a Mason face again. My heart hammered against my ribs. "How do you know my grandmother's name?" Nobody talked about Edith Mason. She died when my mother was young, taking most of the family stories with her. My mother had been a seamstress who worked 70-hour weeks to keep us fed. We'd lived in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment where the radiator clanked all winter and the summers were unbearable. There were no stories of wealth, no hints of a grander past, just survival, dignity, and my mother's quiet insistence that integrity mattered more than money. The old man steadied himself against the doorframe, his sharp blue eyes never leaving mine. "Because my uncle destroyed her." And I stayed silent. His voice broke. "We were partners, Langston and Mason. After the war, they started a company together. Your grandmother owned 50% of everything we built." The words didn't make sense. My grandmother, a business owner? A partner in something successful enough that this man was crying 40 years later? "That's impossible," I said. "My family was never wealthy." Please." Charles gripped my arm with surprising strength. "Come with me. What I'm about to show you will change everything." I should have said no. I had Mrs. Henderson's townhouse to clean after this, and the Kowalskis' vacation home needed deep cleaning before they returned from Europe. My daughter Leah was counting on my paycheck to help with groceries, and I couldn't afford to lose this job by abandoning a house mid-shift. But something in his voice, desperation mixed with relief, guilt mixed with hope, made me set down my scrub brush and follow him. His study was a museum of the past. The walls were covered with framed photographs and documents yellowed with age. He pulled down one photograph with shaking hands, a sepia-toned image showing a young woman in a modest dress standing between 2 men in front of a brick building. Above them, a hand-painted sign read, Mason-Langston Holdings, EST 1947. The woman in the photograph had my face. Not similar, identical. The same high cheekbones, the same determined set to the mouth, the same slight wave in the dark hair. I was looking at a mirror across time. "She never mentioned this," I whispered. "My mother never said anything about a business. Because we made her believe she'd lost everything." Charles's voice was thick with shame. "When your grandfather Harold died suddenly in 1952, my uncle Samuel went to Edith. She was grieving, overwhelmed, alone with a baby daughter. Samuel told her there were debts to settle, papers to sign. She trusted him. He shuffled to an antique desk and pulled out a leather portfolio. She didn't know she was signing away her rights to the entire company. We erased the Mason name from the records and built an empire on land that was half hers." He opened the portfolio, and I saw documents I didn't understand, contracts, deeds, corporate filings with letterheads from decades ago. But one thing was clear, the name Mason appeared on every original document, right beside Langston. "I was 23 years old," Charles continued, his voice barely audible. "Ambitious. Hungry. And I said nothing when my uncle committed fraud. I've lived with that shame every day since. He pulled out a more recent document, a bank statement. But I kept the original papers. And I'd been paying into a trust for 4 decades, hoping someday I could find a Mason heir and make this right. The number at the bottom of the statement made the room tilt. $823,000,000.00. That's not real, I said, gripping the edge of his desk. That can't be real. The properties your grandparents bought are now the foundation of half the commercial real estate in this city, Charles explained, pulling out a property map covered in numbered lots. Mason-Langston Holdings owns the land under 63 major buildings. Office towers. Shopping centers. Medical complexes. Every month for 40 years, rent checks have come in. Half of that money belongs to you. The floor seemed to drop out from under me. I collapsed into the leather chair behind me, my cleaning bucket forgotten in the doorway, soapy water slowly spreading across the Persian rug. 3 years ago, I thought distantly, I had a life. 3 years ago, I'd been Bethany Mason, senior financial officer at Callaway Real Estate Holdings. I'd had a home with a mortgage I could afford. My daughter had been on scholarship at a prestigious prep school. I'd had colleagues who respected me, a boss who praised my work, a best friend who knew all my secrets. Then I'd found the discrepancies. Small at first, invoices that didn't match, transfers to accounts I couldn't identify. But I was good at my job, meticulous, and I'd followed the thread until it led me to the truth. Edward Callaway was funneling client investments into offshore accounts. Millions of dollars that should have been building retirement funds and property portfolios were disappearing into his private empire. I'd done what I thought was right. I'd gathered the evidence, documented everything, and taken it to the board. Within a week, Edward had turned it all around. Suddenly I was the thief. I was the one with unexplained deposits, planted in accounts I didn't even know existed. I was the one escorted out by security while my colleagues watched in shock and whispered behind their hands. My best friend Clara, the woman who'd been maid of honor at my wedding, who'd held my hand through my husband's funeral, who'd helped me raise Leah, testified against me. She showed emails I'd never written, presented documents I'd never seen. 6 months later, I saw their wedding announcement. Edward Callaway and Clara Bennett, married in a private ceremony at the Rosewood estate. The same woman who'd texted me, enjoy being nobody. It suits you. I'd lost everything. My home, my savings, my career, my reputation. No financial firm would touch me. Background checks flagged my name immediately. I couldn't even get hired as a cashier. So I'd taken the only work I could find, cleaning houses for $15 an hour through an agency that didn't ask too many questions. Miss Mason? Charles's gentle voice pulled me back to the present. Are you all right? I looked up at him, this elderly man who'd carried guilt for 4 decades, and then down at the bank statement in my shaking hands. $823 million. There's something else, Charles said softly. He pulled out another document, a property lease. Your former employer, Edward Callaway. His corporate headquarters, the building he runs his entire empire from. Do you know what property it sits on? My mouth went dry. Plot 47 of the original Mason-Langston Holdings, Charles said. He's been our tenant for 12 years. And your grandfather, God rest his soul, insisted on a specific clause in all our leases. He pointed to a paragraph highlighted in yellow. Any tenant found guilty of fraud, embezzlement, or ethical violations can have their lease terminated immediately with 30 days' notice. The words on the page blurred as tears filled my eyes. Edward Callaway had destroyed my life, taken everything I'd built, married my best friend, and walked away triumphant. And the entire time, he'd been standing on my family's land. I thought about Leah, my brilliant daughter, working double shifts at a diner to afford community college because her scholarship had evaporated the moment my name became toxic. I thought about the nights I'd cried in the bathroom so she wouldn't hear me break. I thought about scrubbing the floors of people who used to call me colleague, seeing pity, or worse, satisfaction, in their eyes. I thought about Clara's text message, sent the day I started cleaning houses, designed to break whatever spirit I had left. And I thought about my grandmother, Edith Mason, who'd been erased from history, who died never knowing her legacy would survive. "Mr. Langston," I said, standing slowly. My spine straightened for the first time in months. My voice was steady. "I think it's time Edward Calloway met his landlord." Charles smiled, a real smile that reached his tired eyes. "I was hoping you'd say that." For the first time in 3 years, I felt something I'd forgotten existed. Hope. Not for revenge, though I wouldn't pretend that didn't sing in my veins. But for justice. For restoration. For the chance to show my daughter that integrity doesn't disappear just because the world tries to bury it. The man who'd crushed me because he could was about to learn that some foundations aren't as solid as they appear. And the woman he'd tried to erase was about to reclaim not just her inheritance, but her name. Charles led me deeper into his study, past shelves lined with leather-bound books and decades of memories preserved in frames. He moved slowly, each step deliberate, as though this moment had been rehearsed in his mind 1,000 times. "Sit, please," he said, gesturing to a burgundy armchair that had probably cost more than my entire year's salary. "What I'm about to tell you is a story I should have told 40 years ago." I sank into the chair, my cleaning uniform still damp with sweat and cleaning solution, completely out of place in this room of antiques and inherited wealth. Charles settled into the chair across from me with a heavy sigh. "Your grandfather, Harold Mason, saved my life in France," he began. 1944, I was 18, terrified, pinned down by enemy fire in a village whose name I can't even pronounce. Harold pulled me out of there with a bullet in his own leg. Charles's eyes grew distant. "When we came home, we made a pact. We'd build something together, something that would outlast the war, outlast us. Something good." He reached for another photograph on the side table. This one showed 2 young men, barely in their 20s, standing in front of a modest brick building. They wore suits that had clearly been borrowed or bought secondhand, but their smiles were genuine. The taller man had his hand on the shorter one's shoulder, a gesture of brotherhood, of trust. "That's Harold," Charles said, pointing to the taller man. "And that cocky kid next to him is me." 1947, the day we signed the incorporation papers for Mason-Langston Holdings. I stared at the photograph. My grandfather had my father's build, my father's hands. In the faded image, I could trace the line of my own family tree, a lineage I'd never known existed. "We started with nothing," Charles continued. "A loan from the VA, a handshake deal, and a dream. We bought land nobody wanted, swamps, industrial zones, the edges of the city where nothing was happening yet. Harold had vision. He could see 20 years into the future while I was still trying to figure out next month." "What happened?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Charles's face darkened. "Harold died in 1952. Heart attack. He was only 31 years old." He paused, his hands trembling as he set down the photograph. "My uncle Samuel, my father's brother, he was our lawyer. When Harold died, Samuel went to Edith immediately. Told her the company was drowning in debt, that creditors were circling, that she needed to sign papers to protect herself and your mother from liability." "But it was a lie," I said, the pieces falling into place. "Every word." Charles's voice cracked. "The company was profitable. We had investments lined up, developments ready to break ground." Samuel showed Edith stacks of invoices, fabricated debt statements, threatening letters from banks that didn't exist. She was 26 years old, grieving, with a 1-year-old daughter. She trusted him. I felt sick. She signed. She signed everything he put in front of her, Charles confirmed. Transfer of shares, dissolution of partnership, release of claims. Within a month, the Mason name was erased from every document. Samuel reincorporated under just the Langston name, and when my father died 2 years later, I inherited the whole thing. And you knew. The accusation hung in the air between us. I was 23, Charles said, and I heard 4 decades of guilt in those words. I'd just come into more wealth than I'd ever imagined. Samuel told me it was legal, that Edith had been compensated fairly, that this was just business. And God help me, I wanted to believe him. He closed his eyes. By the time I understood what had really happened, your grandmother had disappeared. I hired investigators. They found her in Ohio, working in a textile factory. I sent money anonymously, but she died when your mother was only 16. My mother never knew, I said. She worked as a seamstress her entire life. She died 3 years ago thinking we came from nothing. I'm so sorry. Charles's voice broke completely. I've carried this shame every day. I built an empire on stolen ground, and I told myself there was no way to make it right. But then, he pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and wiped his eyes. 6 months ago, I was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. Stage 4. The doctors gave me a year at most. The weight of his confession settled over the room like dust. I don't want to die a thief, Charles said. I've spent the last 6 months liquidating assets, organizing documents, searching for any living Mason heir. I'd almost given up. Then you walked into my house wearing a name tag that said, Bethany M., and I saw Edith's face staring back at me. He stood with effort and retrieved a wooden box from his desk drawer. Inside were documents I recognized from my career in finance, corporate charters, stock certificates, notarized agreements. But these were old, the paper brittle, the ink faded. These are the originals, Charles said, handling them with reverence. The real founding documents of Mason-Langston Holdings. Before Samuel's fraud. Before the erasure. He spread them across the desk. Your grandfather owned 50%. These certificates were never voided, Samuel just hid them. Legally, they're still valid. I stood and moved to the desk, my hands shaking as I touched the documents. There was my grandfather's signature, Harold J. Mason *, in confident script across multiple pages. Stock certificates issued in his name. A notarized will stating that his shares would pass to his wife, Edith, and then to his heirs. The company is worth $1.7 billion today, Charles said quietly. Your half is $823 million. I've had attorneys verify every detail. The money is yours, Bethany. It always was. The number was absurd. Impossible. I was wearing a cleaning uniform that smelled like bleach. I had $43 in my checking account. My daughter and I split a frozen pizza for dinner 3 nights a week because it was all we could afford. I started, but the words died in my throat. How can I possibly claim something like this? I can barely pay my rent. I don't have lawyers, I don't have. You have me, Charles interrupted. And you have Richard Hale, the finest attorney I know. He's been preparing your case for months. We can file the ownership claim next week. A sound from the doorway made us both turn. Leah stood there, still in her diner uniform, her apron covered in grease stains. She must have gotten off early and come looking for me when I didn't answer my phone. Mom? Her voice was small, confused. What's going on? Why are you here? I looked at my daughter, 17 years old, exhausted from working double shifts, her college dreams deferred because I couldn't help her. I thought about every apology I'd given her over the past 3 years, every time I'd promised things would get better soon, every night I'd watched her pretend she wasn't worried about our future. Leah, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. This is Charles Langston. He knew your great-grandfather. Charles stood, extending his hand with old-world courtesy. Your great-grandfather was the finest man I ever knew. And your mother is his legacy. Leah looked between us, sensing the weight of something she couldn't quite name. Mom, you're scaring me. What's happening? I picked up one of the stock certificates, my hands trembling. Your great-grandmother, my grandmother Edith, she was a business owner. A partner in a company that... I couldn't finish the sentence. That's worth $823 million, Charles said gently. And your mother is the rightful heir. Leah's face went white. She grabbed the doorframe for support. What? I know it sounds insane, I said quickly. I don't even understand it all yet. But these documents, they prove that my grandfather owned half of this company, and when he died, that ownership passed to my grandmother, and then to my mother, and now to me. $800 million? Leah's voice cracked. Mom, that's not real. That can't be real. It's real, Charles said. And there's more. The man who destroyed your mother's career, Edward Calloway, his headquarters sits on Mason-Langston land. He's been paying rent to us for over a decade. Leah's eyes widened as understanding dawned. She crossed the room and grabbed my hands. Mom, this is it. This is how you fight back. This is how you clear your name. I don't know if I can, I whispered. What if I fail? What if they find some legal loophole? What if you win? Leah interrupted, squeezing my hands tighter. What if, for once, the good guy actually wins? You've spent 3 years telling me that integrity matters, that doing the right thing matters even when it costs you everything. Do you believe that or not? Tears spilled down my cheeks. My daughter, who had every right to be bitter, to be angry at the world that had stolen her opportunities, was looking at me with absolute faith. You're Bethany Mason, Leah said fiercely. You're a fighter. And you're somebody's granddaughter who deserves what was stolen from her. I looked down at the documents in my shaking hands. Stock certificates with my grandfather's name. Contracts signed in 1947. A legacy buried for 40 years, waiting. 823 million? I whispered, the number still impossible to comprehend. That can't be real. But Charles Langston's steady gaze and my daughter's unwavering faith told me that maybe, just maybe, it was. The next morning, I sat in Charles Langston's study surrounded by 70 years of corporate records. Ledgers, property maps, tenant agreements, decades of business distilled into neat rows of numbers and legal language. Charles had given me a key to his house and instructions to take all the time I needed. Start with the current holdings, he'd said before his nurse arrived for his morning medications. See what Mason-Langston has become. What I found made my blood run cold. The modern property management wasn't handled by Langston Holdings anymore. Sometime in the early 2000s, the day-to-day operations had been transferred to a management company. I traced the corporate structure through layers of subsidiaries and shell companies, following the thread deeper and deeper until I found the name at the center of the web. Calloway Real Estate Holdings. My hands froze on the keyboard. I read the name again, certain I'd made a mistake. But there it was, in a 2013 operational agreement. Mason-Langston Holdings had entered into a property management partnership with Calloway Real Estate Holdings, granting Edward operational control over 63 commercial properties in exchange for a percentage of profits. Edward Calloway had been managing my family's legacy for over a decade. The man who'd destroyed my career, who'd framed me for fraud and blacklisted me from the industry, had been collecting fees from my inheritance while I scrubbed floors to survive. I pulled up more documents, my financial analyst training kicking in automatically. The structure was brilliant in its deception. Edward had never purchased the properties outright. Instead, he'd woven his company so deeply into Mason-Langston's operations that he functioned as the de facto owner. He collected rent, negotiated leases, approved developments. To anyone looking from the outside, Calloway Holdings was Mason-Langston. But buried in the original 1947 incorporation documents was a clause I recognized from my years reviewing commercial contracts. I read it 3 times to be sure I understood. Asterisk, in the event that a direct heir of Harold J. Mason or Samuel T. Langston comes forward with legitimate claim to ownership shares, all operational agreements shall be rendered void, and full control of company assets shall revert to the original shareholder structure within 30 days of verification. Asterisk. A reversion clause. My grandfather had protected his family's rights even from the grave. I sat back in the leather chair, my heart pounding. Edward didn't own these properties. He managed them under an agreement that could be terminated the moment I proved my identity as Harold Mason's heir. The irony was so perfect it hurt. My phone buzzed. A text from Leah, * working lunch shift. Made $47 in tips. Better than yesterday, *. I stared at my daughter's message, her small victory, her resilience, and felt rage bloom in my chest like a physical thing. I thought about the day security had escorted me out of Callaway Holdings. Edward standing in his corner office doorway, arms crossed, watching with detached amusement as I was marched past colleagues who wouldn't meet my eyes. Clara beside him, her hand on his arm, her face carefully arranged in an expression of disappointed concern. I remembered the smirk Clara couldn't quite hide as I passed her desk. The whispers that followed me down the hallway. The receptionist, who'd been friendly just that morning, who wouldn't look at me as I handed over my building access card. Enjoy being nobody, Clara had texted me that night. * It suits you. *. I'd believed her. For 3 years, I'd believed I was nobody. But I wasn't nobody. I was a Mason. And Edward Callaway's empire sat on my land. The study door opened. Charles entered slowly, leaning heavily on his cane. You found it, he said, reading my expression. He's been managing the properties for 12 years, I said, my voice tight. All this time, while I was losing my house, while my daughter was working herself to exhaustion, he was collecting fees from my inheritance. I only discovered the connection 6 months ago, Charles said. When I started investigating the modern operations. That's when I knew I had to find you. He settled into his chair with a grimace of pain. But there's something you need to understand, Bethany. Edward doesn't know about the reversion clause. His lawyers never looked back at the original incorporation documents. They assumed the 2013 agreement was ironclad. So we have the element of surprise, I said. For now. But the moment you file ownership claims, he'll know. And he'll fight. I thought about Edward's resources, the lawyers, the connections, the media contacts who'd helped him destroy my reputation. He could drag this out for years, bury me in legal motions, make the fight so expensive and exhausting that I'd have to give up. Fear crept in, cold and familiar. Who was I to fight Edward Callaway? I was a woman who cleaned houses, who split frozen pizzas with her daughter, who'd been broken so thoroughly that I'd stopped believing I deserved better. Mom? I turned. Leah stood in the doorway, still wearing her diner uniform. She must have come straight from her shift. You texted me the address, she said, slightly breathless. I needed to see if this was real. If last night actually happened. It's real, I said quietly. And it's worse than we thought. Edward Callaway has been managing these properties for 12 years. Leah's eyes widened. The same Edward who? The same one. I gestured to the documents spread across the desk. He's been profiting from my family's legacy while I lost everything. Leah crossed the room and stood beside me, looking down at the property maps and contracts. For a long moment, she was silent. Then she spoke, her voice steady and sure. You always told me integrity matters. That doing the right thing costs something, but it's worth the price. She looked at me. You lost your career because you wouldn't stay silent about fraud. You chose to tell the truth even though you knew it would destroy you. Maybe this is how you prove that integrity still matters. That it doesn't just cost, it wins. Her words hit me like a physical force. My daughter, who'd watched me break, who'd worked double shifts because of my choices, believed in me. I don't know if I'm strong enough, I whispered. You're the strongest person I know, Leah said fiercely. You just forgot for a while. Charles cleared his throat. If I may, there's someone you should meet. Richard Hale. He was Samuel's attorney before he discovered what Samuel had done. He's been retired for 15 years, but when I told him about you, he agreed to help. He knows every legal angle Samuel used, which means he knows exactly how to undo them. When can I meet him? I asked. He's waiting in the library. Richard Hale was a tall man in his 70s with steel gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. He stood when we entered, extending his hand with the confident grip of someone accustomed to winning. "Ms. Mason," he said. "I've been waiting 30 years to right this wrong." Over the next 2 hours, Richard laid out the strategy. We'd file quiet ownership claims through a trust, establishing my identity as Harold Mason's heir without alerting Edward to what was happening. We'd gather irrefutable DNA evidence, trace the family line through official records, and compile every original document proving the Mason claim. "The reversion clause is our ace," Richard explained, tapping the incorporation documents. "The moment we activate it, Edward's management agreement becomes void. He'll have 30 days to vacate operational control of all Mason-Langston properties." "Including his headquarters," I said. "Including his headquarters," Richard confirmed. "The building he operates from sits on Plot 47. It's Mason-Langston land. When we activate the clause, he'll have to negotiate a new lease, with you." I imagined it, Edward Calloway sitting across from me, the power dynamic reversed, having to ask permission to stay in a building he'd taken for granted. "How long until we can file?" I asked. 2 weeks, Richard said. "I need to verify the documentation, establish the trust structure, and ensure everything is bulletproof. Edward will throw everything at us. We can't give him any opening." 2 weeks. 14 days until I could begin taking back what was mine. Charles walked us to the door as the sun began to set. The city stretched out before us, lights beginning to twinkle in the gathering dusk. Somewhere out there, Edward Calloway was in his corner office, confident and untouchable, with no idea his foundation was about to crumble. "Are you ready for this?" Charles asked quietly. I thought about my grandmother Edith, tricked into signing away her legacy. I thought about my mother, working herself to exhaustion, never knowing she came from something more. I thought about Leah, my brilliant daughter, fighting for a future while carrying the weight of my ruined reputation. And I thought about integrity, the thing I'd told Leah mattered most, the principle that had cost me everything. Maybe it was time to see what it could win. "I'm ready," I said. I looked out over the city skyline, watching the lights flicker on in the building that bore Edward's name, the building sitting on my family's land. "You took everything from me, Edward," I whispered. "Let's see how you handle losing it all." The law moves slowly until it doesn't. For 2 weeks, I watched Richard Hale work with the precision of a master craftsman. DNA tests confirmed my lineage through 3 generations. Birth certificates, death certificates, marriage licenses, a paper trail connecting me directly to Harold J. Mason. Richard filed the ownership claim through a private trust, quietly re-registering the Mason name on deeds that hadn't listed it in 70 years. "We're building a fortress," Richard explained one afternoon in his office. "When Edward finally sees this, he'll look for any crack, any inconsistency. We won't give him one." On a Tuesday morning in late October, Richard called me. "It's done. As of 9 a.m. today, you are the registered majority shareholder of Mason-Langston Holdings. Bethany Mason owns 50% of $1.7 billion in commercial real estate." I sat in Charles's study, my study now, he'd insisted, and stared at the official documents. My name, typed in clean black letters beside corporate holdings worth more than I could comprehend. "How long until Edward knows?" I asked. "The legal notices go out this afternoon. By tomorrow morning, his lawyers will be on the phone." I ended the call and looked at Leah, who'd been sitting quietly in the corner doing homework. She set down her pencil. "It's happening," I said. She crossed the room and hugged me tightly. "You did it, Mom." "We haven't won yet," I reminded her. "Edward will fight." "Let him," Leah said. "This time, you're not fighting alone." The apartment we'd lived in for 3 years was a third-floor walk-up with paper-thin walls and a radiator that clanked all night. The landlord had raised the rent twice since we'd moved in, knowing we had nowhere else to go. I'd handed over my security deposit from our old house, the one Edward's fraud had cost us, and watched it disappear into maintaining someone else's property. Now, I stood in that cramped apartment for the last time, packing what little we owned. "We don't need much," I told Leah as we filled boxes. Just enough for the townhouse. The townhouse was modest by any standard, 3 bedrooms in a quiet neighborhood, funded by the first dividend payment from the Mason Trust. Richard had advised keeping things simple, maintaining a low profile until the legal situation resolved. It has a backyard, Leah said, her voice full of wonder. An actual backyard. I'd chosen the house for that reason. Because my daughter deserved a place where she could sit outside without listening to traffic noise, where she could breathe without smelling someone else's cooking through the vents. It's not about the money, I reminded her as we carried boxes down the stairs. It's about justice. About restoring what was taken. I know, Mom, Leah said. But maybe you can accept that you deserve nice things too. Edward Calloway received the first legal notice on a Wednesday morning. I knew because Richard's assistant had confirmed delivery. I imagined Edward in his glass-walled office, opening an envelope marked Priority Legal Notice, expecting routine paperwork. Instead, he found a claim of ownership reversion filed by the Mason Estate Trust, citing the 1947 incorporation clause and 3 generations of documented lineage. Richard's phone started ringing within the hour. Edward's lawyers, demanding an explanation. Insisting this was a clerical error, a fraudulent claim, an administrative mistake. Let them talk, Richard said calmly when he called to update me. Every word they say gives us information about their strategy. By Thursday, Edward had convened an emergency board meeting. I knew this because Clara, my former best friend, Edward's wife, had started posting cryptically on social media. Some people will do anything for attention, she'd written. Desperation is a sad thing to watch. Leah showed me the post, her face tight with anger. She's talking about you. Let her, I said, though my hands trembled. She doesn't know what's coming. The media started picking up whispers by Friday. A business reporter tweeted, hearing rumors about ownership dispute involving major downtown properties. Mason heir? Anyone know details? Another, Calloway Holdings facing unexpected legal challenge. Sources say it involves historical land rights. Developing, Clara's posts became more frantic. Standing by my husband during this ridiculous situation. Truth always wins. The irony wasn't lost on me. Edward tried everything. His lawyers filed motions to dismiss, claiming the reversion clause was no longer valid. They challenged the DNA evidence, the documentation, even argued that too much time had passed for me to make a claim. Richard dismantled every argument with surgical precision. The reversion clause has no expiration date, he explained in a conference call with Edward's legal team. And Ms. Mason only recently discovered her rightful inheritance. The law doesn't punish heirs for crimes committed against their ancestors. I listened to these calls on speaker, hearing Edward's lawyers grow more desperate with each conversation. They weren't denying the validity of the documents, they couldn't. They were simply trying to find any technicality that would make this go away. But it wouldn't go away. On the 10th day after filing, Richard received confirmation. The court had validated the Mason claim. Every document had been authenticated. The reversion clause was enforceable. Edward Calloway was managing properties he didn't own, and his lease agreement was now void. It's time, Richard said. We call the shareholder meeting. The Mason-Langston Holdings board meeting was scheduled for 10 a.m. on a Monday morning in the same glass tower where I'd once worked for Edward. The same building where security had escorted me out 3 years ago while colleagues whispered and Clara smirked. I dressed carefully that morning, a navy suit I'd found at a consignment shop, tailored to fit perfectly. Simple jewelry. My hair pulled back in a neat bun. Professional. Unshakable. Leah hugged me at the door. Show them who you are, Mom. Richard met me in the lobby with 2 associates and a banker's box full of documents. Ready? Ready. We rode the elevator to the 42nd floor. The conference room was all glass and steel, with a view of the city stretching out below. Edward's domain. His empire. Built on my grandfather's land. The board members were already seated, men in expensive suits who'd rubber-stamped Edward's decisions for years. They looked up as we entered, confusion flickering across their faces. Edward stood at the head of the table, his expression carefully controlled. Clara sat beside him, her hand possessively on his arm. When she saw me, her face went white. "What is she doing here?" Edward demanded. "This is a private board meeting." "Actually," Richard said, setting down his box of documents, "Ms. Mason called this meeting. As the majority shareholder of Mason-Langston Holdings, she has every right to be here." "This is absurd," Edward snapped. "There's no majority shareholder. I manage these properties under an agreement that became void the moment Ms. Mason's ownership claim was validated," Richard interrupted. He pulled out a court order. "Which happened 6 days ago. You were notified." I walked to the head of the table. Edward didn't move, his jaw clenched, his eyes burning with rage barely contained. "Excuse me," I said quietly. "You're in my seat." For a moment, I thought he might refuse. Then one of the board members, an older gentleman who'd always been cordial to me years ago, stood. "Mr. Calloway," he said carefully. "If the ownership claim has been validated, perhaps we should hear what Ms. Mason has to say." Edward stepped aside, his movements tight with fury. I took the seat at the head of the table, the position of power, the chair that commanded the room. I reached into my bag and pulled out the rubber gloves I'd worn cleaning houses for 3 years. I set them on the polished mahogany table. Several board members stared at them, not understanding. "These," I said, "are what I've been wearing for the past 3 years. While you all sat in this room making decisions about properties that belonged to my family. While Edward Calloway collected fees from land my grandfather bought in 1947. I looked directly at Edward. "You should have checked whose name was written beneath the floors you polished your image on." Gasps rippled through the room. The 1947 incorporation documents give Harold Mason's heirs complete ownership of 50% of all Mason-Langston Holdings, Richard announced, distributing copies of the documents. The reversion clause, which Mr. Calloway's lawyers never bothered to review, terminates all operational agreements when a Mason heir comes forward. "This is a scam," Clara hissed. "She's desperate for money, making up claims." "DNA evidence has been validated by 3 independent laboratories," Richard continued calmly. "Birth certificates, death certificates, and corporate documents all confirm Ms. Mason's lineage. The court has already ruled in her favor." I watched Edward's face as reality settled over him. The color drained from his cheeks. His hands gripped the edge of the table. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. "Justice," I said simply. "You framed me for fraud. You destroyed my career, my reputation, my life. You did it because you could, because you thought I was powerless." I pulled out the original Mason-Langston charter and placed it on top of my rubber gloves. "But I'm not powerless. I'm a Mason. And you've been standing on my land this entire time." Richard slid the ownership transfer documents across the table. "Sign here, Mr. Calloway. Transfer operational control back to the rightful owner." Edward stared at the documents, his jaw working. Around the table, board members shifted uncomfortably. Clara's hand had fallen away from Edward's arm. "You can't do this," Edward said, but his voice lacked conviction. "It's already done," I replied. "You can sign willingly, or Richard can file for forced transfer. Either way, Mason-Langston Holdings is mine." The room fell silent. Outside the windows, the city gleamed in the morning sun, a city built on land my grandfather had the vision to buy when nobody else wanted it. Edward reached for a pen. His hand trembled, just slightly, but I saw it. The great Edward Calloway, shaking. He signed. I pulled the documents toward me and added my own signature below his, Bethany Mason, majority shareholder. My hand was steady. My heart was unshakable. "This meeting is adjourned," I said. Edward didn't go quietly. Within hours of signing the transfer documents, his PR team launched a counteroffensive. By that evening, my phone was flooded with news alerts. Former analyst makes questionable inheritance claim. Callaway Holdings disputes ownership fraud allegations. Sources say Bethany Mason has history of financial irregularities. They were using my past against me, the fraud charges Edward himself had fabricated 3 years ago. Anonymous sources claimed I was desperate for money, willing to forge documents, that this was an elaborate con targeting a respected businessman. Clara took to social media with a carefully crafted statement, "It's heartbreaking to watch someone I once called friend stoop to such levels. My husband has built an empire on hard work and integrity. We will fight these baseless claims." The comments section filled with people who believed her. People who remembered the headlines from 3 years ago, who assumed where there was smoke, there was fire. Leah found me sitting at the kitchen table of our new townhouse, staring at my phone, my hands shaking. "Mom, don't read that garbage," she said, taking the phone from me. "You know the truth. What if people believe them?" I whispered. "What if I went through all of this just to be destroyed again?" "Then we show them the evidence," Leah said firmly. "Richard said we have everything we need. So let's use it." She was right. And Richard had been preparing for exactly this moment. While Edward's team was busy spinning narratives for the press, Richard's investigators were doing something far more valuable, following the money. "We've been tracking Callaway's financial activities since you first came to us," Richard explained during an emergency meeting at his office. "And what we found is damning." He spread financial records across the conference table, years of them, meticulously organized and highlighted. Edward used Mason-Langston subsidiaries as a personal piggy bank, Richard continued. He created shell companies, routed client investments through them, and skimmed millions off the top. The same fraud you discovered 3 years ago, he never stopped. He just got better at hiding it. I stared at the documents, my financial analyst training allowing me to see the patterns immediately. False invoices. Inflated expenses. Money disappearing into accounts registered to companies that existed only on paper. "This is exactly what I found before," I said, my voice tight. "The same scheme. Scaled up considerably," Richard added. "We estimate he's embezzled over $47 million in the past 3 years alone. And because he was managing Mason-Langston properties, he used your family's legacy as his cover." "Can we prove it?" I asked. Richard smiled grimly. "We already have. I've been working with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit for the past week. They're very interested in Mr. Callaway." The call came 3 days later. Clara's lawyer reached out to Richard, requesting an urgent meeting. When we arrived at the downtown office building, Clara sat alone at a conference table, her designer handbag clutched in her lap, her eyes red from crying. Gone was the confident woman who'd smiled for cameras at her wedding. This Clara looked terrified. "I need immunity," she said before anyone could speak. "I'll tell you everything, but I need immunity." "That depends on what you have to tell us," Richard replied calmly. Clara's hands trembled as she pulled out her phone. "I have recordings. Emails. Text messages. Everything Edward said about framing Bethany. I kept them as insurance. I knew what kind of man he was. Her voice broke. "I didn't think it would ever come to this." She looked at me for the first time, and I saw genuine fear in her eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I was so angry when you got the promotion I wanted. When Edward paid attention to you instead of me. When you were the one everyone respected. So when he said he needed to get rid of you, I helped him. I planted the emails. I doctored the documents. I testified against you. Each word was a knife, but I kept my face neutral." "Why?" I asked quietly. "Because I wanted what you had," Clara said, tears streaming down her face. "Your integrity, your reputation, your strength. And when I couldn't have those things, I wanted to destroy them." She pushed her phone across the table. "The FBI came to me yesterday. They told me I could cooperate or go to prison. So here it is. Everything. Richard examined the phone, scrolling through messages and recordings. His expression remained professionally neutral, but I saw the glint of satisfaction in his eyes. "This is enough," he said. "The federal prosecutor will want to speak with you directly." Clara nodded, wiping her eyes. She looked at me one more time. "I know you'll never forgive me. I don't deserve forgiveness. But I need you to know, you were always better than me. That's why I hated you." I stood, gathering my things. "I don't hate you, Clara. I pity you. You traded everything real for something fake, and now you have nothing." The final board meeting was scheduled for a Friday morning, 2 weeks after I'd taken control of Mason-Langston Holdings. This time, the conference room was packed. Board members, lawyers, journalists allowed in by special permission, and federal agents standing quietly against the back wall. Leah sat in the gallery section, wearing the blazer I'd bought her for college interviews. She gave me a small, encouraging smile. I walked to the front of the room in my tailored navy suit, carrying a leather folder. Richard and his team flanked me. Edward sat at the opposite end of the table, his expensive suit unable to hide the fear in his eyes. "This meeting is called to order," I began, my voice steady. 3 years ago, I sat in this building and told the board of Callaway Holdings that Edward Callaway was committing fraud. I had evidence, documentation, everything needed to prove his crimes. I paused. I was escorted out by security, framed for the very crimes I discovered, and blacklisted from my career. I opened my folder and removed the original Mason-Langston charter, placing it on the table. "Everything you built, Edward, every lie you told, every dollar you stole, every life you destroyed, it stands on my grandfather's land." I met his eyes. "And I'm here to collect rent." The room was absolutely silent. Richard stood and distributed new documents to the board members. "These financial records show a pattern of embezzlement spanning over a decade. Mr. Callaway created shell companies using Mason-Langston subsidiaries, funneling client investments into personal accounts. The FBI has verified every transaction." One of the federal agents stepped forward. "Edward Callaway, you're under arrest for wire fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit fraud." Edward's face went white. "You can't, this is a setup, she's lying." "We have recordings, Mr. Callaway," the agent said calmly. "Your wife's testimony. Bank records. Emails in your own words describing how you framed Ms. Mason." He pulled out handcuffs. "Please stand." I watched as Edward stood on trembling legs. The man who'd destroyed my life, who'd smiled as security escorted me out, who'd built an empire on lies and stolen land. "This isn't over," Edward hissed as they cuffed his hands. "I'll fight this. You're standing on borrowed ground," I said quietly. "You always were." The federal agents led him toward the door. Edward looked back once, his face twisted with rage and disbelief. Then he was gone. The room erupted in whispers. Cameras flashed. One of the board members, the same elderly gentleman who'd supported me during the ownership transfer, stood and began to clap. Others joined him. The applause built until it filled the room. I looked up at Leah, who was crying and smiling at the same time. My daughter, who'd believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself. The story hit national news within hours. Blacklisted analyst reclaims $823 million fortune, exposes decade of fraud. The woman who cleaned her way to justice, Bethany Mason's incredible story. From scrubbing floors to boardroom power, how one woman dismantled her accuser's empire. My phone rang constantly, reporters, interview requests, people I hadn't spoken to in years suddenly wanting to reconnect. I ignored most of them. Richard held a brief press conference on the courthouse steps, reading a prepared statement. Ms. Bethany Mason has been fully exonerated of all charges filed against her 3 years ago. Evidence proves beyond doubt that she was framed by Edward Callaway to cover his own criminal activities. Her reputation, her integrity, and her family's legacy have been restored. That evening, I stood in Charles Langston's study, my study, and looked out over the city. The same skyline I'd stared at while scrubbing floors, wondering if I'd ever feel like a person again. Charles sat in his favorite chair, weaker now but smiling. Your grandfather would be proud. I wish I could have known him, I said. You do know him, Charles replied. You're exactly like him. Same integrity. Same strength. Same refusal to stay down when the world tries to break you. Leah appeared in the doorway. Mom, Richard's on the phone. The judge wants to schedule the formal restitution hearing. I took the call, discussing dates and procedures, making decisions about my company, my family's company, with confidence I'd forgotten I possessed. When I hung up, I found Charles watching me with watery eyes. What? I asked gently. Integrity doesn't disappear, he said softly. It just waits for the right moment to rise. I crossed the room and took his frail hand. Thank you for giving me that moment. No, my dear, Charles said. Thank you for proving it was worth the wait. Through the window, I could see the lights of the city, including the building that had been Edward's headquarters, now dark and emptied, waiting to be transformed into something new. Something honest. Something Mason. Charles Langston died on a Tuesday morning in early spring, with sunlight streaming through the windows of his bedroom and my hand wrapped around his. He'd been fading for weeks, the inevitable decline of a body that had lived 93 full years. But his mind remained sharp until the very end, his eyes clear and kind even as his breath grew shallow. You restored the name, he whispered, his voice barely audible. You restored the honor. I squeezed his hand gently, tears sliding down my cheeks. And you restored my life. A faint smile crossed his lips. No, my dear. You did that yourself. I just reminded you who you were. You gave me a chance when no one else would, I said. You saw me when I was invisible. I saw a Mason, he replied. I saw my friend Harold in your eyes. That same fire. That same refusal to bend. His breathing hitched, and I felt his fingers tighten around mine. Promise me something. Anything. Don't let what happened make you bitter. Use it to light the way for others. His eyes found mine, still bright despite everything. There are so many in the dark, Bethany. So many who've been pushed aside, silenced, erased. Be their light. I promise, I whispered. Charles closed his eyes, that small smile still on his face. His hand relaxed in mine. And then, peacefully, he was gone. I sat with him for a long time, holding the hand of the man who'd changed everything. The last connection to my grandfather. The person who'd believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself. Thank you, I said to the quiet room. For everything. Charles's will was read a week later in Richard Hale's office. He'd left his entire estate to me, his remaining shares in Mason-Langston Holdings, his home, his personal effects, and a letter written in his shaky handwriting just days before his death. Dear Bethany. By the time you read this, I will have joined your grandfather in whatever comes next. I hope we're having a good laugh about how we managed to hide your inheritance in plain sight for 70 years, These shares make you the undisputed majority owner of Mason-Langston Holdings. 68% of a company your grandfather built and my family helped preserve. Use it wisely. Use it well, but more than that, use it to help others. I've watched you these past months, seen how you carry your pain with grace and your power with humility. You understand that wealth isn't about what you own, it's about what you do with what you have, light the way, Bethany. For all those still stumbling in the dark, With love and admiration. Charles. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in my pocket, next to my heart. He was a good man, Richard said quietly. The best, I agreed. And I intend to honor his wishes. The Mason Foundation launched 6 months later. I'd worked with legal experts, nonprofit advisors, and women who'd survived their own professional assassinations to create something meaningful. Not just a charity, but a lifeline. The foundation provided legal support, career retraining, and financial assistance to women over 40 who'd been blacklisted, forced out, or silenced due to corporate abuse. Women like me, qualified, experienced, competent, who'd been erased because they threatened someone's ego or discovered someone's crimes. I donated half my wealth to fund it. $400 million to start, with annual contributions ensuring it would continue indefinitely. Are you sure about this? Richard had asked when I first proposed it. That's a substantial amount of capital. I'm sure, I'd replied. I don't need $800 million. I need to make sure no other woman has to choose between her integrity and her survival. The press conference announcing the foundation drew national attention. I stood at a podium in the same building where Edward had been arrested, now completely transformed. 3 years ago, I was blacklisted from my career for telling the truth. I lost my job, my reputation, my savings. I cleaned houses to survive, wondering if my daughter would remember me as a failure. I paused, looking out at the crowd of reporters, advocates, and women who'd reached out after my story broke. But I wasn't a failure. I was targeted. And there are thousands of women like me, women who discovered fraud, reported harassment, refused to be silent, who've been systematically erased from industries they helped build. I gestured to the building behind me. This was Edward Calloway's headquarters. The place where he built an empire on lies. Today, it becomes the Mason Foundation Center for Women's Empowerment. A place where women can get legal help, career counseling, mental health support, and financial assistance while they rebuild their lives. The cameras flashed. Questions erupted. What would you say to Edward Calloway now? A reporter called out. I considered the question carefully. Edward was in federal prison, serving a 15-year sentence for fraud and embezzlement. Clara had received probation in exchange for her testimony and was living somewhere in Arizona, keeping a low profile. I would say that you can tear down a person's reputation, but you can't destroy their character. That takes root too deep. I smiled slightly. And sometimes, when you try to bury someone, you're actually planting seeds. Leah called me from her dorm room at Georgetown Law School that evening, her face bright on the video chat screen. Mom, I saw the press conference, she said. You were amazing. You're biased, I replied, smiling. Maybe. But I'm also right. She adjusted her laptop camera. Professor Brennan asked if you'd be willing to speak to her class next month. She teaches a course on corporate ethics and whistleblower protections. I'd be honored, I said. Leah's expression grew serious. Mom, can I ask you something? Always. Do you ever regret it? Reporting Edward in the first place? If you'd just stayed quiet, you could have kept your job, your reputation. We wouldn't have gone through all that pain. I thought about those 3 years. The humiliation. The exhaustion. The nights I'd cried myself to sleep wondering how I'd pay rent. But I also thought about who I'd become. Who Leah had become. Not for a second, I said firmly. Because staying silent would have meant losing something more valuable than a job or a reputation. It would have meant losing myself. I leaned closer to the screen. And I would have been teaching you that survival is more important than integrity. That's a lesson I never want you to learn. Leah's eyes filled with tears. I'm so proud of you, Mom. I'm proud of you too, sweetheart. Look at you, Georgetown Law. You're going to change the world. I learned from the best, she said softly. 1 year after Charles's death, I stood in front of the Mason Foundation Center, looking at the new bronze plaque mounted beside the entrance. It bore a quote I'd chosen carefully, words that had sustained me through the darkest times. Asterisk, integrity may go broke, but it never dies. Asterisk. The building hummed with activity. Women working with career counselors. Legal teams preparing whistleblower cases. Support groups sharing their stories, finding strength in community. I'd hired some of the staff myself, women who'd been where I'd been, who understood what it meant to be erased and rebuild yourself from nothing. Inside, I could hear laughter. Hope. The sound of lives being reconstructed. My phone buzzed with a text from Leah, aced my contracts exam. Celebrating with study group. Love you, Mom. I smiled and sent back a heart emoji, then climbed into my car, a modest sedan, nothing flashy. I'd never been interested in displaying wealth. That had always been Edward's obsession, not mine. As I drove toward home, Charles's old house, which I'd kept exactly as he'd left it, filled with his warmth and memories, I caught sight of my reflection in the rearview mirror. The woman looking back at me was different from the one who'd scrubbed floors 3 years ago. Not because of the money or the power or the vindication. Different because she knew who she was. The wrinkles around my eyes had deepened, but they came from smiling now, not crying. My hands, once raw from cleaning solution, were soft again but stronger somehow. My hair had more gray, which I'd stopped covering up. I looked like myself. Finally. The city skyline appeared ahead, buildings gleaming in the golden hour light. My grandfather's city. The place he'd bet on when everyone said it had no future. Somewhere in one of those buildings, a woman was probably sitting at her desk right now, discovering fraud or facing harassment or realizing her career was being sabotaged. She was probably terrified, wondering if she should speak up or stay silent. Tomorrow, she might find the Mason Foundation. She might discover she wasn't alone. She might learn that integrity doesn't make you unemployable, it makes you unstoppable. I turned onto my street, where trees were beginning to bloom and neighbors waved from their porches. Simple. Peaceful. Real. Sometimes, I said aloud to myself, to Charles, to my grandfather's memory, you have to lose everything to realize you owned it all along. Not the money or the company or the legacy. The truth. The strength. The unshakable core of who you are when everything else is stripped away. I pulled into my driveway and sat for a moment, watching the sun set over the city. This was my second beginning. Not a return to what was, but a transformation into what could be. And it was just getting started. I smiled, quiet and certain, and walked toward home.